لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ولي الأولين والآخرين وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وصفيه وخليله صلوات الله وسلامه عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. أيها الإخوة, respected brothers and sisters, by the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we completed the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and today we begin a new series of lessons, and this series of lessons is in explaining Aḥkām al-Janāiz, some of the rulings pertaining to Janāiz, and some of the Fiqh of Janāiz, and also some of the bid'ah, some of the innovations which are connected to Janāiz. And when we say Janāza or Janāiz, we don't mean by that the Salah only. Rather, the meaning, the Islamic meaning of Janāza is everything connected to the deceased, from the taking of his soul to what should be done before, during, after his death, ghusl, kafan, dafan, salah, and then the scholars attached to that adab ziyarat al-qabr, the etiquettes of visiting the graveyards. So all of this is intended by the word janaza, and its plural is janaiz. They say as-salatu ala al-janaza, the salah upon the janaza, meaning the janaza salah. That is a part of janaiz. And so this is going to be a series of lessons by the permission of Allah, which covers everything pertaining to janaiz. And it's not hidden from anybody here the importance of these types of lessons, especially when it pertains to something related to death. Because al-maut, death, it is the only certainty which we have. In our lives, everything else is a possibility. Everything else is a probability. And the only certainty is death. And yet we see, subhanallah, how many of us are forgetful or negligent regarding this certainty. People prepare for their graduation, and it's only a probability, a possibility whether they will even live that long in order to graduate. People prepare and save and invest for marriages, and this is only a probability. People invest and prepare for exams and careers and graduation, and all of this is a probability and a possibility. People prepare for children and houses, and people invest their money for pensions, and all of this is a mere probability or a possibility. And the only matter which is known by yaqeen is death. And therefore one's aql, logic would dictate that a person places most of his focus on that which is known by yaqeen, and a person places less focus on that which is a probability or a possibility. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran about the certainty of death. He said, "Kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut," that every soul shall taste death. وَإِنَّمَا تُوَفَّوْنَ أُجُورَكُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, and then you will be given your recompense in full on يوم القيامة. فَمَنْ زُحْزِهَا عَنِ النَّارِ وَأُدْخِلَ الْجَنَّةِ فَقَدْ فَازَ. So whoever is removed and saved from the fire and entered into Jannah, he has succeeded. He said, وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا مَتَاعُ الْغُرُورِ. And as for the life of this dunya, it is mata'ul ghurur. It is a temporary and deceptive form of enjoyment and provisions. And Allah subhanahu has decreed death for every single person, regardless of how righteous or how disobedient or how beloved to Allah or how far away from Allah that person is. Even the prophets and the messengers, they could not escape death. Allah subhanahu said, وَمَا جَعَلْنَا لِبَشَرٍ مِّن قَبْلِكَ الْخُلْدِ, and we have not made for any person before you al-khuld. The meaning of al-khuld is a life of eternity. أَفَإِن مَّاتَ فَهُمُ الْخَالِدُونَ. If you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, die, do you think your opponents and your enemies will live forever after you? All of them will pass away. And the only exception to this was Isa alayhi salam. بَلْ رَفَعَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهِ. And Allah subhanahu raised Isa alayhi salam before he could die. And Isa alayhi salam will descend before Yawm al-Qiyamah, and then he will die. And this is why in the Quran there are these three words in various forms which are repeated in the Quran again and again. Hum fiha khalidun. Hum fiha khalidun. They'll remain in it for eternity. They'll remain in it for eternity. Khalidina fiha. Khalidina fiha abada. These words have never been mentioned regarding the dunya. They are only mentioned regarding the akhirah. So the akhirah, it is darul khuld. It is the place of eternity. And this dunya, darul fana. It is something which passes by quickly. And the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in order to keep a Muslim focused on his priorities, i.e. the akhirah, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to advise us to make much mention of death. Whether it's in our gatherings or our sittings, or in our khutab, our lectures, our sermons, that a person is always remembering the death, the qabr, the akhirah, Jannah, Jahannam, the reward, the punishment. He said in the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anh, أَكْثِرُوا مِن ذِكْرِ هَذِمِ اللَّذَّاتِ. In another narration or wording, أَكْثِرُوا مِن ذِكْرِ هَادِمِ اللَّذَّاتِ. Make much mention of that which destroys desires. Make much mention of that which lessens worldly desires. He said, al-maut, death. And from the benefits of remembering the akhirah and getting our priorities right and mentioning death a lot is, as is mentioned in the wording of this hadith, he said sallallahu alayhi wasallam, أَكْثِرُوا ذِكْرَ هَذِمِ اللَّذَّاتِ. Make much mention of that which destroys desires, i.e. death. He said, فَمَا ذَكَرَهُ عَبْدٌ قَطْ وَهُوَ فِي ضِيقٍ إِلَّا وَسَعَهُ عَلَيْهِ. That whenever a person is in a difficult situation, is feeling restricted in his life, when he thinks about the akhirah and he thinks about death, وَسَعَهُ عَلَيْهِ, then things become easy for that person. That restriction that he feels, that distress that he is feeling, he finds comfort. He said, وَلَا ذَكَرَهُ وَهُوَ فِي سَعَةٍ إِلَّا ضَيَّقَهُ عَلَيْهِ. And whenever a person mentions death and he is in a situation of sa'ah, everything is easy and flourishing and open and comfortable, then it refocuses him and it makes everything tight again. Hassanahu al-Albāni. So despite this encouragement for us to always focus on the eternal life and make much mention of the death, of the akhirah, of the barzakh, the qabr, yet many amongst the people are completely negligent of this certainty. And this is because of the dunya and the environment we are living in. This environment, especially in this time, the greatest focus is in trying to live as long as possible. and remaining as young as possible, and not only trying to gain more of the dunya, but competing with each other in who can gain most from the dunya. So a person wanting an increase in his dunya provisions, this is natural. But competing with each other in who can accumulate the most, this is what is dispraised in the Quran. And this is what makes a person forget. And this is the meaning of the surah which all of you know. Alhaakum at-takathur. Alhaakum at-takathur. Alhaakum meaning you have been neglected, you become neglectful, you become negligent, you become forgetful by what? At-takathur. And at-takathur is competing with each other in accumulating and gathering more and more. He said, حَتَّى زُرْتُمُ الْمَقَابِرِ, until you visit your grave, meaning death. كَلَّا سَوْفَ تَعْلَمُونَ ثُمَّ كَلَّا سَوْفَ تَعْلَمُونَ. Then you shall surely know. And once again, you will know to the end of the surah. And the reality of the wealth of a person, your wealth is that which you have eaten, and that which you are wearing, and that which you are spending. And anything which is saved is not your wealth. That is for those who come after you. And those who come after you, they may spend it or they may waste it. So the reality is that the only thing that you benefit from your wealth is that which you eat with, and that which you are wearing right now, and that which you have given in sadaqah. Everything else you are collecting for others to benefit from. For others to benefit or for others to waste from your progeny and your children. And it's mentioned regarding the Salaf, how after they would turn, or after they would reach 40 years old, it's mentioned regarding the Salaf, that after they would reach 40 years old, they would begin to focus on the akhirah. And they would place the dunya behind them. And after 40, they would focus on the akhirah in preparation for the akhirah. Ibn al-Jawzi rahimahullah, he mentions, يَنْبَغِي لِلْعَبْدِ عِنْدَ إِتْمَامِ 40 سَنَةً, that when a person completes 40 years old, then it is befitting for him أَنْ يَجْعَلَ جُلَّ هِمَّتِهِ فِي التَّزَوُّدِ لِلْآخِرَةِ, that he makes his main focus in gathering his provisions for the akhirah. So before 40 years old, it's acceptable that a person is looking forward, and he's looking forward to building his life and reaching the pinnacle of his life. So a lot of his focus and concentration, dedication is in building and career and house and transport. But then after a person reaches that 40 years old, and as you know, 40 sana, 40 years, is the pinnacle of a person's strength and maturity and intellect. And this is why all the prophets and the messengers, when were they sent? They were sent at 40 years old. They became prophets at 40 years old, because this is the pinnacle of their maturity and their intellectual strength. But after that, then as Ibn al-Jawzi rahimullah said, أَنْ يَجْعَلَ جُلَّ هِمَّتِهِ فِي التَّزَوُّدِ لِلْآخِرَةِ, that he should make the majority of his focus in gathering his provisions for the akhirah. Allah subhanahu said, حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ, and then he reaches his maturity. وَبَلَغَ 40 سَنَةً, and he reaches 40 years old. قَالَ رَبِّ أَوْزِعْنِي أَنْ أَشْكُرَ نِعْمَتَكَ الَّتِي أَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيَّ, and he says, O my Lord, enable me to show shukr to you for the blessings which you have bestowed upon me. وَعَلَى وَالِدَيَّ, and upon my parents. وَأَنْ أَعْمَلَ صَالِحًا, and enable me to do righteous actions. When? حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ وَبَلَغَ 40 سَنَةً. When he reaches his maturity and he reaches 40 years old. Not that before 40 years old a person does not ask Allah subhanahu for tawfiq for righteous actions. But especially when a person has reached 40 years old, then he begins to turn towards the akhirah. And he asks Allah to enable him and to allow him to make a shukr. وَأَنْ أَعْمَلَ صَالِحًا تَرْضَاهُ. And that I do righteous actions which you are pleased with. وَأَصْلِحْ لِي فِي ذُرِّيَّتِي. And rectify for me in my children and my offspring. إِنِّي تُبْتُ إِلَيْكَ. I have repented to you. وَإِنِّي مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. And I am from those who show submission to you. Ibn Kathir rahimahullah said, وَهَذَا, meaning هذه الآية, in this ayah, فِيهِ إِرْشَادٌ, there is guidance for a person, لِمَنْ بَلَغَ الْأَرْبَعِينَ, for the one who has reached 40 years old, and يُجَدِّدْ التَّوْبَةِ, that he should renew his tawbah, وَالْإِنَابَ إِلَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ, and his focus and his dedication and him returning to Allah Azza wa Jal, وَيَعْزُمْ عَلَيْهَا, and he becomes focused on this matter. And therefore, أيها الإخوة, these types of lessons in which we explain the Aḥkām, the rulings and the Fiqh of Janāiz are important for every single one amongst us. Because there is nobody here except that he shall pray or he shall be prayed upon. Or he will shroud or he will be shrouded. Or he will give a ghusl or a ghusl will be given to him. Or he will bury or he will be buried by others. And the ruling of the hukam of the janazah, that it is fardun kifaya. And the meaning of fardu kifaya is that it is a communal obligation. The janazah, whether it is salatul janazah, al-kafan, al-ghusl and everything else pertaining to al-janazah, it is fardu kifaya, it is a communal obligation. Meaning, amongst our Muslim community, there has to be a sufficient group of people who know these rulings and understand these rulings. And at any time they are ready to perform the janazah. It is not fard ayn. It is not an individual obligation. So for example, Salatul Dhuhr, Salatul Asr, this is an individual obligation. Every single person has to pray Salatul Dhuhr and Salatul Asr. Like Ramadan, every single Muslim. And I cannot pray for you and you cannot pray for the other. Every single person is individually obligated. The Janāiz, it is fardu kifaya, a communal obligation. As long as some of us know the rulings and we are ready to fulfill these matters, then the burden and the sin is removed from the other members of society. However, if nobody amongst us does it, then every single one in our society is sinning and the burden remains upon them. So this wajib, this fard, there has to be a group from our society which takes it upon their shoulders to study, understand, know, and then be prepared. At any time, a person may have to bury, pray, give a ghusl, shroud a deceased. And don't think that it is only those who are older than you that you will be burying or giving a ghusl to or shrouding. Because death does not respect tartib, sequence. When it comes to entering into the dunya, there is a complete sequence. The grandfather comes first, he's born first. Then the father is born next. Then the child is born next. Then the grandchild is born next. So when it comes to entering into the dunya, there is a clear sequence from the oldest to the youngest. When it comes to leaving the dunya, there is no sequence. How many times has a father had to bury his son? Or a grandfather had to bury his grandchild? Or a person outlived many of his peers and many of those who were younger than him? And neither does death respect health or illness or poverty or wealth. So don't think that the poor die first and the rich remain, or the ill die first and the healthy remain. Al-Shafi'i rahimahullah, he said in his poetry, فَكَمْ مِنْ صَحِيحٍ مَاتَ مِنْ غَيْرِ عِلَّةٍ وَكَمْ مِنْ سَقِيمٍ عَاشَ حِينًا مِنَ الدَّهْرِ. كَمْ مِنْ صَحِيحٍ مَاتَ مِنْ غَيْرِ عِلَّةٍ. How many times has a healthy, strong person died without any illness? وَكَمْ مِنْ سَقِيمٍ عَاشَ حِينًا مِنَ الدَّهْرِ. And how many people who are ill and weak, and yet they live for a long time. Even in your communities, in your families, you may know of people who have been given a notice by a doctor that because of this illness or this illness, you have 3 weeks to live, or 5 months to live, or less than a year to live. And that person lives many, many years. And another person who was strong and healthy, and the decree of Allah, it reached that person and he passed away. So the point is, we have to know and understand these rulings. And in terms of these lessons, the book or the curriculum that we will be going through is a book which was authored by a great Imam of our times, from the greatest muhaddithin of the contemporary era, and he is none other than Shaykh Muḥammad NāṣirudDīn al-Albāni rahimahullah, al-Imam al-Alim, al-Muhaddith al-Allāmah Muḥammad NāṣirudDīn al-Albāni rahimahullah. And he authored a book called Aḥkām al-Janāiz wa bid'iha, or wa bid'uha, the rulings of Janāiz and the innovations of Janāiz. And in this book, he mentioned many rulings and many stages of the janazah. And his book, it has surpassed many other books of fiqh in terms of the detail which he went into. In fact, he mentions in the introduction, he said, وَلَقَدْ حَاوَلْتُ أن أستقصي فيه كل ما له علاقة بموضوعه من المسائل التي لها دليل من الكتاب والسنة. He said, I have attempted to mention as many masail which I can, which are connected to the janaiz, along with the evidences from the book and the sunnah. وأعرضت عما كان مستنده مجرد الرأي. And as for those ahkam which are merely based upon al-ra'i and not based upon evidences, I have turned away from them. لأن الموضوع تعبدي محض. Because everything pertaining to the janaiz is ta'abbudi. There is no لا مجال للعقل. There is no place for logic and logical thinking. It is all based upon Quran and Sunnah. And he mentioned, وأوردت في أوله بعض الفصول والمسائل التي لا تذكر عادة في باب الجنازة في عامة كتب الفقه. And I have mentioned in the beginning chapters of this book many issues which are not ordinarily mentioned in the books of janazah, in the chapters of janaiz, in the books of fiqh, like the wasiyah, وعلامات حسن الخاتمة, and like the indicators of a person's good death, and many other issues. So this book, the author rahimahullah, he divided it up into 3 or so sections. Firstly, what is before death, and then what is during death, and then what is after death. And he speaks about what is before, during, and after death for the person who has died, and what is before, during, and after death for those who are around the deceased, and what is before, during, and after death for the relatives of the deceased, and the aḥkām pertaining to all of them. And you could say that this book, it is divided, generally speaking, in 19 different chapters or sections. The first of them, he mentions ما يجب على المريض, the obligation upon the ill person, meaning the mayyit, the one who is about to pass away, and he feels that he's in his last illness and death is very close to him. What is the obligation upon him as he's approaching those moments, in terms of al-rida, being pleased with the decree of Allah, and as-sabr, being patient and not hoping or desiring for death, and fulfilling the obligations. And he mentions the obligations, and also the wasiyah, and the point of bringing witnesses for your wasiyah, and so on and so forth. And of course, all of this we will go into detail. And then he mentions the obligation of those who are around the deceased, like the talqeen, like the ruling of prompting the person to say La ilaha illallah, and how he should be prompted to say La ilaha illallah. And then he speaks about the third subsection, the obligation of those people who are around the deceased after the person has passed away, in terms of closing his eyes and making dua for him and covering his body, to the rest of the issues. And then he mentions certain matters which are permitted for those people who are around the deceased. And then in the fifth subsection, he speaks about the obligation upon the relatives of the deceased, meaning the extended family and the relatives of the deceased. And then in the sixth subsection, what is haram upon the relatives of the deceased. And then he speaks about an-na'i bil janaza, and that is in terms of publicizing and announcing deaths, and what type of death announcements are allowed and when is it haram. He also speaks about in the 8th chapter alamati husn al-khatima, the indicators of a person's good death. The Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he used to make dua to Allah, Allahumma inni as'aluka husn al-khatima. Oh Allah, I ask you for a good ending. We should always ask Allah subhanahu for a good ending. Then the 9th subsection, he speaks about the ruling of people praising the deceased. And then he starts speaking about the funeral procession, meaning the ghusl, the 10th chapter, and then the kafan or the takfeen, the shrouding of the deceased, and how the adult male is to be shrouded, and how the female is to be shrouded, and how the child is to be shrouded, and how many sheets, and what type of sheets. And then in the 12th subsection, he speaks about the carrying of the janazah, and the following of the funeral procession, and the virtues and the etiquette and the manners of doing so. And then he speaks in the 13th chapter in some detail regarding Salatul Janazah and the issues of fiqh pertaining to Salatul Janazah, like the number of takbirat and the difference of the fuqaha regarding this, and that which should be recited, and the difference of the fuqaha reciting this, regarding this. Then he speaks in the 14th section regarding ad-dafn, the burial, and then at-ta'ziyah, how to offer condolences, and what is the correct way to offer condolences. Then he speaks about those actions which benefit the mayyit, and then he speaks about the adab of visiting the graveyards, and in the 18th or so subchapter, that which is not permitted to be performed at the graveyards. And then he finishes his book by talking about some of the bid'ah, some of the innovations which are linked to the janazah from the beginning to the end. And then he ended his book, the author al-Imām al-Albāni rahimahullah, by saying, وَإِنِّي لَأَسْأَلَ اللَّهِ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى أَنْ يَنْفَعَ بِهَذَا الْكِتَابِ كُلَّ مَنْ قَرَأَهُ And I ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala that He allows this book to be of benefit for every person who reads it. وَأَنْ يَكْتُبَ لِي أَجْرَهُ, and He writes and records for me its reward. وَمِثْلَهُ لِمَنْ كَانَ سَبَبُ تَأْلِيفِهِ, and He rewards the person who was the cause for me writing this book. وَلِمَنْ قَامَ عَلَى طَبْعِهِ, and for the one who printed and published this book. إِنَّهُ سَمِيعٌ مُجِيبٌ, and he authored this book whilst he was residing in Damascus in Syria on the 24th of Muharram in 1388 after the blessed hijrah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that is in 1968. And as is the style of Shaykh Albāni rahimahullah, his books are often full of takhrij of hadith and mentioning details in terms of the tasheeh and the tad'if of the hadith. We'll try to summarize that as much as we are able to do so. There is also an English resource which is based on this book, and that is the book authored by Shaykh Muḥammad al-Jibali, which is entitled Funerals, Regulations and Exhortations. And this book, it is available in English, and it is pretty much a translation of the book of Shaykh Albāni, and then he added to it many other chapters which are relevant and contemporary. And in fact, he mentions in his introduction, he said, the author al-Jibali, he said the main source and backbone for this book is the book of al-Albāni, Aḥkām al-Janāiz. A nearly complete translation has been completed or included as is shown in the table, and then he mentions some of the other things which are included in this book. So this book, Ayyul Ikhwa, is a good resource. It's a good resource for every family to have at home, and also that when we study it, that you make your notes, and then whenever there's a need to refer back to it, you can open that chapter, you can open your notes, and you can refer back to it. And it's available, I checked quickly at Dar es Salaam, for about £12 from Dar es Salaam. And if anybody would like to buy it before the next lesson, so we can go through it inshallah, there's a piece of paper here. If you put your name and your number down, whoever wants a copy, the Masjid will order a copy, and then you can just reimburse the Masjid. It's roughly £12, but we can check. So if you put your name and your number down, and the sisters can do so as well, and we'll try to get them before next Friday. We ask Allah subhanahu for tawfiq and hidayah and al-thabat ala sunnah wal iman. Until the next week's lesson, هذا والله أعلم وبالله توفيق وصلى الله على نبينا وسلم.